Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Tony McAleavy from Oklahoma State University. Today, I'm going to talk about cognizance of disaster scale and complexity using a visual metaphor approach. In terms of the scope of today's session, I'll outline the problem statement to begin with, and then due to the centrality of metaphor as a concept underpinning this study, I will define metaphor and explain why metaphor was selected for use in this study. We'll then look at the broader methodology and the research question. Then we'll go through some of the findings and the analysis leading to the tentative hypothesis that's resulting from this particular study. To conclude, we'll look at some of the limitations of the methodology and some recommendations for future research. And as I always like to do, I'll end this session with just a nice picture. Okay, there's been an increasing recognition over recent years of that disasters and catastrophes are becoming increasingly frequent and more severe in terms of the damage, the infrastructure damage, the fiscal cost, and also the number of lives lost. Moreover, there's been increasing recognition at a theoretical level that there is a difference between everyday emergencies, which may be big, disasters, and catastrophes. Indeed, we've got some excellent theories from Quarantelli, Wilson-Goskowska, Bissell, and indeed Lewis et al. In the 70s were talking about a gate that we've perhaps gone through in terms of technological developments and connectivity of our society, which is leading to greater scope, scale, and magnitude of disasters and catastrophes. The key point being, indeed, the interest for the problem statement within this study was looking at the notion that the complexity of disasters and catastrophes and the impact of them can be so severe that our existing planning, our preparedness and response tools, such as the incident command system, perhaps might not be sufficient and indeed may be counterproductive, just to use some words there from Bissell. At the heart of it is a recognition that disasters and indeed catastrophes destabilize and overwhelm our traditional mechanisms of planning. So the way that we do things, perhaps at an everyday emergency, indeed a low-level disaster level, may not work at a catastrophic level. So in terms of this study, I sought how to understand how practitioners conceptualize disaster response, indeed command and control, using metaphor. Why, might you ask, would I choose to use metaphor? Well, metaphor is pervasive to everyday life, not just language. We find metaphor used verbally, we find it in marketing, in our everyday life, in symbiotics and symbols and signs that we see around us, and it's used to convey a deeper, more in-depth understanding of feeling or what the message that's being conveyed. So metaphor is the notion of understanding a concept by linking it to another concept. It's non-literal. So, for example, traffic was murder. Most offices around the world, you find somebody using that every other week. Oh, traffic day, how was murder? The literal meaning of murder is somebody illegally killing that particular person. They're using that metaphor to convey how they felt about that experience of being stuck in and indeed dealing with traffic. It gives us a deeper insight to how they feel and understand what they were going through. Another example, things got on top of me. The ebb and flow, certainly as an academic, of our work schedule and our work priorities changes. Sometimes, work might get on top of you, but sometimes you might have a better week and I got on top of my workload. So it's using height as a metaphor for control. Similarly, prices are rising. We see that in the media a lot, talking about prices are rising, stock markets going up and down. So the relative process of going up, that's higher is better, lower is not, it's going down. Underpinning these three generic examples is the idea that metaphor serves as symbolic shorthand. It's a shorthand way of communicating and understanding complex ideas. So from trying to understand something as complex as disaster and catastrophe response, I thought metaphor might A, be novel, and B, uncover some quite useful and in-depth understanding. Moreover, why metaphor? Well, From an organizational perspective, if you view command control coordination, NIMS, ICS through an organizational lens, there's an argument that all we know about organizations, is grounded in Gareth Morgan's seminal organizational metaphors. His 8 metaphors of organizations as a machine, organism, brain, culture, political system, psychic prison, flux and transformation, and an instrument of domination are argued to be the foundations of our conceptualization of organizations theory. Dignan argues that metaphor expresses connections in level of thought. So from a verbal point of view, from a narrative point of view, they express how people are shaping and formulating complex ideas in their brain. It gives them an insight into how they see the world around them. And as I said, they serve as symbolic shorthand, packages of data, of visual and linguistic data that give you a deeper insight beyond the literal word. Moreover, metaphor actually has a transformative potential. So change your metaphor, change your worldview. So if your organization perhaps uses organizations as a machine, and that's how they see it, someone's off work, fix that part in, a mechanistic perspective, then you can change by using narratives based on organism, brain, culture, different metaphors. So it can change how that organization, indeed people, see itself. Indeed, Chang, 2017, and his research on ICS talks about mechanistic and organistic elements of ICS. So organizations can be one or the other. So ICS is in itself a temporal organization. And why I decided in my study to use both linguistic metaphor and the visual element focused on herein is a picture's worth 1,000 words. A picture can convey much deeper, more detailed insights than on the individual words, the linguistic words alone. Okay. The research question was, how do practitioners metaphorically interpret command and control? The idea being, well, different agencies are required to respond within a command and control structure, the NIMS, National Incident Management System, ICS, the Incident Command System, is part of it. So how do practitioners understand it? How do they make sense of it? What does it mean to them? So this study, and it's probably gives you a lead in from the research question, was underpinned by interpretivism. There was 31 semi-structured interviews that included linguistic questions and a visual task. So there was 1 pilot, 15 USA and 15 UK interviews. The sample frame was purposive, so targeted sampling. There were participants from the Federal Emergency Management Agency, State Emergency Management, local fire departments, local law enforcement, and local emergency medical services here in the US and their equivalents in the United Kingdom. In terms of analysis, there was inductive qualitative metaphor analysis. So there was analysis on the transcripts of the interviews and also of the diagrams provided, which I'll give you examples in a couple of slides. In terms of coding, Morgan's seminal organizational metaphors, machine, political system, culture, brain, etc. Lakoff and Johnson's master metaphor list, which was an attempt to categorize every metaphor used in English language, and then Steen's metaphor identification process, which allows you to identify metaphors in general use that aren't Morgan or Lakoff and Johnson. So it's a general code. The focus on what I present will be on the USA visual corpus. In terms of the broader study, there was a theory of interoperability metaphors, which was published in 2019. And that is a natural language developed based on the metaphors used by emergency managers in the UK and US. So it's not a new glossary of terms. It is an analysis and a theory based on the metaphors used by practitioners in their natural language. Building on Morgan's origins, the seminal organizational metaphor, metaphors he's put across and published, I developed 3 conceptual metaphors. One Here's the Trivial Pursuit Pi, using Trivial Pursuit Pi to understand interoperability problems. It identifies why interoperability problems occur in a multi-agency environment. In terms of scale, the implications of scale on disaster, the command and control as a candle and as a golden thread are published earlier this year, are metaphors would help us understand the implications of scale, going from emergency, everyday emergency, to disaster to catastrophe on our command and control systems, whether that's ICS and NIMS, or gold, silver, and bronze and CONOPS in the UK, or indeed any other country. The command and control as a golden thread conceptual metaphor highlights the vulnerability of affecting command and control over increasing scale and distance through the metaphor of golden thread. The part of the data that was the novel data was the 30 visual metaphors, 15 USA, 15 UK. So simply asking participants to draw what they see, how they see command and control. No other information was provided, no other guidance was provided. They were simply asked within a broader semi-structured qualitative interview, can you draw me a representation of command and control? That was it. Given that Morgan has 8 metaphors in an organizational sense, and the master metaphor list from Lakoff and Johnson has literally hundreds of metaphors, I was quite surprised, and probably say pleasantly surprised, because it made the analysis a little simpler, at the level of consistency in terms of what was found in the metaphorical analysis. The key metaphor from the master list from Lakoff and Johnson in all of the diagrams was status as position. Boss at the top, subordinates at the bottom, and then boots on the ground further below. So the metaphor of height as control and height being related to your status, your position, was there in every single one of the 15 diagrams. The other was one law enforcement participant had elements of the political system, metaphor, brain, alongside the status as position. So we'll look at some examples to see what this looks like actually in a visual, because it's not exactly that engaging when it's just a table. Here's 3 examples. So law enforcement, ICS. So we've got ICS, UC, Uniform Command, got the deputy, liaison, ops, standard ICS diagram. This one from FEMA, from Federal Emergency Management Agency, has the hierarchical elements that are similar to the ICS organigram, but it talks about competence, talks about command, and then it talks about control and narrative form, but still has that status as position. This particular one from a fire department participant links situational awareness into command, which can be single or unified, local EOC, state EOC, federal EOC. Policy links in to command, and then you've got lines of communication which link into the branches, which in here is fire, law enforcement, EMS, the tasks down the side, single resources. So quite a complex diagram. The outlier was this particular representation. Yes, it has ICS, which is then got your incident commander, and the ICS takes part in outlying circles. So rather than using status as position, they've used the spoken wheel configuration. There's elements of network perspectives here. So it's a very different conceptualization. So this particular participant saw command and control in a very different manner. So one of the key things that we found, and I'll just go through the tentative hypothesis, was that both in the linguistic data and the visual data, the ICS, through its development, its mandate in 2004, for all organizations, for all emergency management and response organizations, has become a metaphor for command and control. ICS, as we know within NIMS, is the command, control, and coordination component. It sits within that policy as a tool. But actually the language in the written narratives, and the written narratives from the transcripts of the interviews, and indeed the visual data, suggests that it's become a metaphor for command and control. So ICS is seen as command and control, not as an application of command and control, which links in to some of the data from I think it's Drabeck and others that talk about how embedded ICS has become since it emerged and began to be developed in the late 70s. Beyond that, there was a common hierarchical framing. So we have the traditional model of emergency management, McIntyre, the civil defense, paramilitary origins, which that links to. Though we do know that there's a professional model, which McIntyre talks about, but Blomgren and O'Leary talk about professional model, which is based more on networks, coordination, and collaboration. So we see that both the professional model and the traditional model, but in the visual diagrams, it's more based on the hierarchies. So it's more aligned to that traditional paramilitary type approach. The key point that leads to the tentative hypothesis was that only one of the diagrams in the US had anything other than a local representation. So a single fire department participant was the only one, I showed you the example, that included nodes for local level, state level, and federal level. So focusing on that complexity of the organization. The tentative hypothesis put across is that there's the heavy use of a top-down hierarchical frame, which focuses on compliance with ICS and NIMS and standardization, actually minimizes the conceptualization, the cognition of complexity and disaster scale. Reason being is that when I was asking the question about command and control, part of my research, I mapped out what the organigram for the US command and control system looked like from the National Response Framework, National Disaster Recovery Framework, NIMS, and other organizational documents. And it's a lot more complicated than a ICS with state, federal nodes. As you know, and you ladies and gents will be eminently familiar with it, there's the incident command point, there's the area command, and that'll link into a local EOC. Local EOCs, there may be dozens, if not more, counties within a state that lead in and link into the State Emergency Operations Center. State Emergency Operations Center links into the Regional Response Coordination Center from FEMA, one of 10. Those in turn link in with FEMA's National Response Coordination Center, which is part of DHS and links to their National Operations Center. DHS links into 22 other organizations: National Infrastructure Coordination Center, Strategic Information Operations Center, FBI, other EOCs from other departments in DHS, the National Military Command Center, and the National Counterterrorism Center as well. These can all be brought to bear depending on the scenario. So if we think about COVID-19, well, COVID-19 is not just restricted to one state or two states. It's affecting almost everywhere, albeit at different levels. Some states are more affected. So we've got most jurisdictions will have an emergency response element linked together, activated, which will link into the state, which again will link into FEMA. So the complexity, the size of this organizational structure that works in reality is very much different to the local ICS perspective that was seen on the imagery. It's not to say that these practitioners, these highly experienced specialists with many years of experience, aren't thinking about disaster scale or complexity of organizations, but actually in terms of command control coordination, the focus is simply on ICS, making sure they align to ICS because it's mandated. So in terms of limitations of this study, it's a temporal snapshot. Yeah, the visual data I've talked about today was 15 participants. Broader study was 30 participants. So it's a snapshot of the here and now when I collected the data. So it's not generalizable, although Maxwell does say that actually large samples are more suited to empirical studies. So it was not a positivist study, it was interpretivist. So it generally works. The small sample frame, it worked for what I required. And as Patton talks about, there's no real specific rules for how you develop your sample frame. It doesn't mean more data, more accuracy. That said, for future research, there is things that can be done. Larger samples would be useful. Collect more visual samples, then do a deductive study applying some of the emerging disaster scale theory. Bissell's continuum of magnitude, Quarantelli's emergency disaster catastrophe. Apply those and see how they're represented in the data visually. Also, a broader qualitative inductive study of how scale is perceived. An inductive way, speaking to practitioners and see how they are making sense of and understanding this difference between an emergency, a disaster, and catastrophe. These would all build on the tentative hypothesis that I have and the limited data that's been used to date. Okay, and just to finish, I always like to end with just a nice picture. That's the Edmund Lowe Library on campus in Stillwater at Oklahoma State, just next to my office. My name is Tony McAleavy. It's been a pleasure talking to you, and if you have any questions, please let me know.